You all set?
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you going to introduce me?
Yes. Yes. And I must explain, the last time Chris was here, he spoke over his time limit, so that's why I asked him for the time and then had him double check it. It's been a great privilege and an honor to work with Mr. Chris Dixon, a senior research fellow from the Department of Modern Languages at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland. Chris is a member of the United Kingdom's Chartered Institute of Linguistics and holds 2 master's degrees from Glasgow University. And Dixon recently edited, as he pointed out, 4 Years in Europe with Buffalo Bill, which is available in our gift shop upstairs. And his current publication will be coming out at the end of this summer, his edition of John Burke's From Prairie to Palace. He's also putting the finishing touches on his manuscript, Buffalo Bill in Barcelona, looking at the Spanish tour of the Wild West. Chris speaks, how many languages is it now? 10. It's gone up since 2, hasn't it? So, Chris is very prolific in prolific in foreign languages. In fact, he does speak Lakota. And as you will see in this presentation here, he uses his Lakota to get a deeper understanding of the American West. And even though he grew up in Glasgow, I consider him to be probably the leading authority on the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And if you ever want to partake of his marathon trips through the Battle of the Little Bighorn, I do encourage you to do so. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Chris Dixon. Too many wires. There we go, thank you.
How do I follow that? Follow that by saying that on the 11th of September 1714, the Catalan rebels in Barcelona surrendered to James Fitzjames, who was the first Duke of Berwick, who was the illegitimate grandson of the James VI that John referred to, the illegitimate son of James VII. He was a general of the French army. The previous year, 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht had been signed, and by the terms of the Treaty of Utrecht, which effectively drew the frontier lines on the map of Europe that lasted until the end of the Napoleonic Wars a century later, the Catalans as a people were deprived of national recognition. The Catalans were divided between Spain, between Italy, between France. They were also in the independent principality of Andorra. So they were basically divided up among 4 different nations. Okay, he's really lost it this time, hasn't he? He's reading the wrong lecture. No, I'm not. I knew that the issue of the Stuarts would come up in both of the previous talks. I knew that the issue of borders and frontiers would come up in both of the previous talks. And I knew that the issue of Scots as mobile people, as generals in other people's armies, would come up in John's talk. And I thought I would begin talking about Scots soldiers in the American West by talking about the Scots as soldiers on frontiers in Europe. Because at the beginning of the 18th century, Catalonia was a frontier that exhibited some of the features that we would see in the American West, some of which I'll refer to in the next few minutes. Now, I could talk about Catalonia for quite some time, but I'm not going to. Shaw, Alistair MacKinnon. Alistair MacKinnon, Anya Matar. For those of you that don't have Gaelic, you might recognise that man not as Alistair MacKinnon of Stornoway in the Isle of Lewis. You might recognise that as a portrait from the National Portrait Gallery of Canada, and you might think of that man as Sir Alexander Mackenzie. I suspected, and I'm glad he did, that Jeremy would refer to the Lewis and Clark expedition of the first decade of the 19th century. But of course, there was a European who led an expedition that crossed the North American continent 10 years before Lewis and Clark did so. And he was Sir Alexander Mackenzie, Alistair MacKinnon. The map that I show you there depicts a substantial territory that people referred to as Assiniboia. There's still a place called Assiniboia in Canada, but the term Assiniboia was used towards the end of the 18th and in the early part of the 19th century to describe a vast area, about 25% of modern Canada. It included part of the states of North Dakota and Montana. And Alistair Mackenzie started his journey from the Great Lakes region. He went all across Assiniboia, and from Assiniboia he went from Fort Chipewyan all the way down the Peace River to reach the Pacific Ocean in 1793. And when he reached the Pacific in 1793, he had the name Alex Mackenzie, no Alexander, no Sir, just Alex Mackenzie from Canada by land, 22nd July 1793. What is a frontier? I think nowadays we think of frontiers in terms of internationally recognised lines drawn on maps. We might think that the places that Alistair Mackenzie travelled through were all Canada. But in 1793, he is marking from Canada. When people were coming out to the United States, to Wyoming and Montana, to these areas that were called territories in the early part of the 19th century, they talked about coming from the United States, coming from the States, sometimes into the Great American Desert, sometimes towards this Jeffersonian concept of a Great American Garden. But they were coming from the States. They were coming to somewhere else. And in many cases, they were not coming as Americans. They were coming as Poles, as Swedes, as Russians, as Scots, as Irish, as Hungarians. They were coming away from the States into a new country. But it was a country that they would make the United States. And a key role in forming the United States in this part of the world was played by the US Army. And in the US Army, there were a significant number of immigrants, people not born in the North American continent. And I want to spend the remainder of my talk today talking about one officer and a handful of enlisted men who were in the United States Army in the post-Civil War period when this part of the world was moving towards becoming the United States. It's quite difficult to find Scots in the officer caste in the United States Army in the 19th century. There's a very good reason for that. We tend, those of us that are historians and academics working in the old world, we tend to think of class, the distinction between various strata in society as described by class, as something that is quite a European phenomenon. Quite often the story of the United States is presented in a way, the history of the United States is presented in a way that is relatively classless. But the army unquestionably was not like that. There was a huge distinction that was a class distinction between the officer class in the United States Army and the rank and file, the men. And the people who were native-born Scots, that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, would all have been in the rank and file. But we do find the phenomenon of Scots Americans in the officer caste. And the one that I'd particularly like to focus on today is Ronald Slidell Mackenzie. He took quite an interesting, or his father took quite an interesting approach to developing the surname. It was Mackenzie, this Mackenzie's grandmother, who was a native-born Scot called Mackenzie, and it was his father's mother who was called Mackenzie. His father was called Slidell. And as a sign of devotion to his old Scots mother, Ronald Slidell Mackenzie's father decided to start calling himself Slidell Mackenzie. So if he'd followed the normal tradition of taking surnames, he would just have been Slidell, maybe have taken the mother's name as a middle name, but it was the mother's name, the Mackenzie name, that this man, whom you see before you, his father, chose as his major surname in recognition of his Scots ancestry. Now, I would argue that Mackenzie was one of the most successful military commanders in the United States Cavalry in the American West. If I were to present that argument in detail, it would take me significantly more than the 18 or so minutes that I have left for this talk, which I am doing my best to stick to. I do want to say, though, that Mackenzie had a distinguished Civil War career, first of all with the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery, the 41st US Infantry, and then the 24th US Infantry, that saw him fighting at 2nd Battle of Bull Run, Antietam, Gettysburg, the 2nd Battle of Petersburg during the siege, Cedar Creek, Five Forks, and being involved in the fighting immediately preceding the Confederate surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. When he came out into this part of the world, he fought principally in the Southern Plains. He was involved in the engagements that preceded the Red River War in West Texas. He fought in the Red River War, and then he came up to this part of the world and played a significant part in one of the major engagements of the so-called Great Sioux War. On the Southern Plains, he commanded the 4th Cavalry against the great Comanche leader, Quanah Parker, at Blanco Canyon on the 10th of October 1871. He fought what was called the Battle of the North Fork of the Red River in the Red River War of the 20th of September 1872, mainly against Comanche people. And then the battle that really was the culminating battle of the Red River War against the Comanche people that took place at Palo Duro Canyon on the 28th of September 1874, where his command of 4th Cavalry defeated Comanche, Kiowa and Southern Cheyenne people. These were all incredibly significant engagements in their own right in the prosecution of the wars in West Texas and the Southern Plains in the early 1870s. But in 1876, there were a couple of engagements in Montana, one of which I'll come to later. In June of 1876, there was a fight on Rosebud Creek, and General George Crook, who was also of Scots ancestry. I was going to say a wee bit more about Crook than I ultimately decided to do, both because of time, but also when we were discussing these presentations, myself and Jeremy and John a couple of days ago, we were talking about this issue of Scots and Scots-Irish. And because I could trace Mackenzie back to Scots Scots-born ancestry, and I was only absolutely certain about Scots-Irish ancestry for Crook. I thought I would just stick to Mackenzie. But Crook was in command of the US forces at the Battle of the Rosebud in 1876. Crook's defeated at the Battle of the Rosebud. He retires to Goose Creek at present-day Sheridan, Wyoming. He sends for reinforcements, and among the reinforcements that he sends for, Mackenzie's 4th Cavalry. And in October of 1876, near present-day Buffalo, Wyoming, and if anyone's over in the Buffalo area, if you go to the Jim Gatchell Museum, which doesn't compare to the Buffalo Bill Historical Centre, of course, either in terms of size or in terms of range of what it has to offer, because it's the closest museum to the site of this fight that came to be known as the Dull Knife Battle, the Battle of Wolf Mountains. It's got a variety of names, but Mackenzie was responsible for defeating the Northern Cheyenne, who were involved in the so-called Great Sioux War of 1876. Should say the Cheyenne people don't refer to the War of 1876 as the Great Sioux War. They don't refer to it as the War for the Black Hills, which is what Lakota people tend to say. The Cheyenne people call it the War Up North. And the Cheyenne people had always, the Northern Cheyenne people, those people who call themselves Sotayo and Omasis, rather than Tsitsisa, which is the sort of standard word that's used for the Cheyenne people generally. These people always regarded the Powder River country as being Northern Cheyenne country. And they regarded the fights that were taking place in 1876 and 1877 as about defending Northern Cheyenne interests in the Powder River country, much more so than defending Lakota interests in and around the Black Hills. And Vo'ohe'eva, known in English as Dull Knife, from an English translation of his Lakota name, Tamila Peshni. Tamila Peshni is a joking name that actually means he forgot to sharpen his knife. And there's a whole story about how he was given that name by Lakota people, but it's the name that he was generally known by. And he and the great Northern Cheyenne leader, Okochamlochrieta, and believe you me, trying to pronounce Cheyenne words is incredibly difficult. So apologies if there are any Cheyenne speakers here. I just know that I don't do the whispered vowels in Cheyenne credit. His name actually translates as Little Coyote, but he was better known as Little Wolf. Dull Knife and Little Wolf were actually not both present at that battle that took place over near Buffalo, Wyoming. They had actually parted ways just a couple of days beforehand. But it's generally regarded as being the crucial battle in ending Northern Cheyenne involvement in the so-called Great Sioux War of 1876-77. I'll tell you one brief anecdote from Northern Cheyenne oral history just before I move back to my Scots. For the Northern Cheyenne people, the sad thing about this defeat, or the saddest thing about this defeat, was that working with the 4th Cavalry, there were Lakota people who had fought alongside them at Little Bighorn the previous year. Crook was the master of recruiting Indians to fight Indians. He had developed that tactic in the Southwest. Particularly, he had come to the realisation that if you wanted to track and fight Apaches, you needed Apaches to track and fight Apaches. So as the 4th Cavalry were coming up from the south, they recruited Lakota scouts to come out and work with the 4th Cavalry at Pine Ridge Agency. And the night before the fight in the Wolf Mountains, some of these Lakota guys were talking back and forth with the Cheyenne people that they would fight the following day. And to the Cheyenne people, who generally have a great respect for Lakota people and a tremendous closeness to Lakota people, particularly the northern Lakota people. The idea that they had been betrayed and that their camp, where their women and children and their supplies for the winter were located, had been found by people that they had fought alongside the previous year, is something that's still spoken about with great sadness up on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation around Glamdeer, Montana. That's as much as I want to say about the officer cast, because of much greater interest and much greater statistical significance in terms of the number of people who were involved. The majority of Scots in the Western Army in the post-Civil War era were in the rank and file. But there's something that I really have to mention before we move on to them. I'm sure you recognise the climactic battle scene from They Died With Their Boots On, where we have the Australian, Irish-American Errol Flynn being shot down after he makes his magnificent last stand by the Greek Irish-American playing the part of Crazy Horse. It's an interesting intercultural nexus in its own right, I think. It's a wonderful film, of course. Errol Flynn is a tremendous George Armstrong Custer, even if history plays no part in the narrative structure of the film. Because, of course, the reality of those dry Montana hills is represented by that national monument, rather than by heroic historiography of last stands. And some of you, certainly those of you that are aware of Custer's correspondence, will know that there is a story that Custer might have been a Scot. The story that Custer might have been a Scot depends on whether or not you regard the Orkney Islands, just off the northeast coast of Scotland, as being Scotland. Now, some Orcadians do not. Some Orcadians will say, we're from the Orkney Islands, we are Orcadian, we were Scandinavians, we are now by choice allied, associated with Scotland, but we're Orcadians. When Custer was in New York in April of 1876, just a couple of months before he died at Little Bighorn, he received this letter from a guy called John Custer, not spelt in the same way. Custer spelled C-U-S-I-T-R, which is the Orcadian spelling of a name that's pronounced Custer. And this guy wrote to George Armstrong Custer saying that two of his ancestors had immigrated to New York, they'd been traders, and that he thought that there might be a link because he knew that these guys had changed the spelling of their name to suit the American environment, drop the non-pronounced I, spell it Custer, because that's how you pronounce it anyway. And George Armstrong Custer, 23rd of April 1876, from New York, writes to his beloved wife, I received a letter from a gentleman at Kirkwall in the Orkneys of the name of Custer, wrote the general. He traces our relationship to the family back to 1647 and gives the several changes the name has undergone, Cursiter, Cursida, Cussiter, Custer, and they all belong to the same parish. We have a saying in Italian, se non è vero, è ben trovato. It might not be true, but it's well told. Frankly, it's almost certainly rubbish. People who have studied Custer's genealogy are fairly convincing in their arguments that in his case, Custer comes from the German name Köster. So the idea that George Armstrong Custer was a Scot is spurious if you don't take into account the Scots-Irish connection, because he unquestionably has Scots-Irish wards and Kirkpatricks and Armstrongs in his lineage. So there is a Scots connection for George Armstrong Custer, but I would not accept the argument that he was a Scot based on the letter that intrigued him a couple of months before he died. Nor would I accept the argument that there were 5 pipers at Little Bighorn. A native of Missoula, Montana, and graduate of Glasgow University, the ancient historic Papal University in the West End of Glasgow, from which John and I are both graduates, even though we work in the more modern university with a strong Presbyterian trait that at one stage did not admit Catholic students. John Pearson of Missoula, Montana, graduate of Glasgow University, went back to Scotland exploring his Scots heritage, learned to play the bagpipes, and then started frequenting bars in Missoula, Montana. I don't know if he frequented bars in Missoula, Montana before he went to Scotland, but he would have been under 21 before he went to Scotland, so I invite you to draw your own conclusions. But he writes in the Highlander Quarterly in October 1975 that he was talking about his bagpipes when this guy beside him said to his brother that he had researched the US Army Department of History at Washington and had discovered in the archives a reference to Highland bagpipes at Little Bighorn battlefield. He said, I visited the scene of the battle and learned that 5 pipers apparently buried their bagpipes in a secret cache a day or so before the battle. I don't think they were ever found. Se non è vero, è ben trovato. That's unquestionably got no basis in historical fact. Not just because the musicians, and I'm not disputing that there may have been pipers among the musicians that were with the 7th Cavalry. There was certainly at least one Scot among the musicians for the 7th Cavalry, but those of you that are familiar with the history of the Great Sioux War will know that if it hadn't been for the fact that General George Armstrong Custer left his band at the Rosebud Depot, the New England Patriots would never have won their first Super Bowl. You are aware that Adam Vinatieri, who kicked the winning field goal when the New England Patriots won their first Super Bowl, was the great-grandson of Felice Vinatieri, who was the bandmaster of the 7th Cavalry, who did not die at Little Bighorn because Custer left the entire band at the Rosebud Depot. He did have 9 Scots-born soldiers at Little Bighorn. He had 9 Scots-born soldiers and a 10th that I will argue we must unquestionably consider a Scot, even though he was born in Rugby, England, that strange country that John said that there's been a union since 1707, but given that the term Stuart has cropped up on a number of occasions, I was brought up thinking that when James VI inherited the English throne at the beginning of the 17th century, Scotland extended its borders to the English Channel. And that's a view that I continue to hold. We're going to take the border back in 2014, but at the moment we've extended our borders to the English Channel. There are 3 Scots memorialised on that national monument at Little Bighorn. Private John Stuart Hilly, to whom I will return shortly, Private William Moody, and Private Charles Scott all lost their lives on the 25th of June 1876 at Little Bighorn. William Moody was the first of them to die. We know this because Moody died in the early part of the fighting. His Company A was commanded by Reno, or was part of Reno's battalion at the start of the fighting at Little Bighorn. We know that he died in what was called the Valley Fight, probably about 90 minutes before the main engagement developed at the other end of the Indian village when Custer attacked. Charles Scott and Charles Scott's body was never identified, so we don't know for a fact where he died, but we know that he was listed among the dead. and that his Company L was with Custer's battalion. John Stuart Hilly's body was recognised on Custer Hill. His body was recognised because he was one of the tallest members of the regiment, and he was identified on that basis. Sergeant Alexander Brown and First Sergeant James Hill and Private Peter Thompson all fought at Little Bighorn and survived. Remember, the idea there were no survivors is a myth. There were no survivors of the 5 companies who were under Custer's direct command on the afternoon of the 25th of June 1876, but there were hundreds of survivors of the 7th Cavalry who were involved in the engagement at Little Bighorn 25th and 26th of June 1876. Private James Callan, Private Thomas Conlon, Private David McWilliams and Private Joseph Milton were not present. We know that Joseph Milton was on detached duty. He was from Glasgow. Joseph Milton, there's a district in Glasgow called Milton. I don't know if there's an association there. We know that Joseph Milton was from Glasgow. We know that he had been a professional soldier when he enlisted in the 7th Cavalry. That was what he gave as his occupation. And we know that he was on detached duty, involved in recruitment at the time of the battle. That's why he wasn't there. We know that Private David McWilliams was from Edinburgh, and we know that Private David McWilliams was in the band. Therefore, we know that Private David McWilliams was in detached service at the Rosebud depot because the band did not go with Custer. We don't know what happened to Private James Callan, and we don't know what happened to Private Thomas Conlon. The official records say not present, reason not known. I invite you to draw your own conclusions. I want to talk a bit more about John Stuart Hilly. John Stuart Hilly was not John Stuart Hilly. He was John Stuart Forbes Stuart. He was, by inheritance, a viscount within the Stuart nobility. He ran away to America and assumed the name of Hilly and joined the US Army as a private. There are various stories about the family scandal that led to his sudden departure for the States. The 2 most often repeated stories are either that he ran away from gambling debts or that he ran away because of an affair with a serving girl. Now I invite you to draw your own conclusions. I don't find the evidence about either to be fully convincing. But what I can tell you for a certain fact is that in St John's Episcopal Church in Edinburgh, which you see pictured there, it's in the west of Edinburgh near the gardens of Edinburgh Castle, there is a memorial to John Stuart Hilly, which reads, "In memory of John Stuart Forbes of the 7th Regiment of United States Cavalry, born 28th of May 1849, killed in action 25th June 1876. It's the only commemoration in Scotland for any of the Scots who died at Little Bighorn. And if any of you are going to Edinburgh anytime soon, or when you're next in Edinburgh, if you go to St John's Episcopal Church, the rector there is always happy to let people in to see the memorial for John Stuart Forbes Stuart. I don't know what his viscountal title would be, but I know that if you look him up in Debrett's Peerage or one of these standard reference works on peerage, you'll find out all about the Stuart Forbes Stuart lineage. So that was the English-born Scot who died at Little Bighorn. The most famous Scot who fought at Little Bighorn and survived was this man that we have in front of us, John Thompson. John Thompson was one of those who won the Medal of Honour at Little Bighorn. The citation on Thompson's Medal of Honour award says that after having voluntarily brought water to the wounded, in which effort he was shot through the head, he made 2 successful trips for the same purpose, notwithstanding remonstrances of his sergeant. What a remarkable story. That bit of the story is true. Cheyenne oral history again tells us about who was shooting at the water carriers. There were a number of men with Custer, or with Custer's command, who were actually with Reno and Benteen, who on the evening of the 25th and of the 26th of June made their way down to the ford in the Little Bighorn River that you can see there. The water course has changed slightly over the years, but it's in the general direction of my photograph. They made their way down that ravine to get water for the wounded. You've got to remember that at Little Bighorn you had an army attacking a town. It was an army against a people. And a lot of the guys who rushed out to defend their wives and children that day had a late night the night before because they were celebrating what had happened to Crook the previous week. So a lot of the men were sleeping late, and they actually got up out of their rests. Some were having their breakfasts when they rushed out to fight, and they fought almost all day. And at the end of the day, when it was clear that these people up on the top of the hill weren't going to be posing much of a threat, they went off back to have something to eat and have a rest. Now, they wanted people to keep an eye on them, but the people that kept an eye on them were young boys in the main. And they handed over the weapons to these young boys, 12, 13, 14, said, keep an eye on those guys up on the hill, and if anything happens, come and get us, and we'll get back involved in the fighting. And I was told this story by 2 old women up in the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, whose reservation name is Kills at Night. And how their family got the name was because their grandfather, who was about 12 or 13 at the time, was given a gun that he'd never fired before. He'd never fired a rifle before. And he was told to listen for anybody coming down and just shoot off into the darkness if they heard anything. And this young boy heard somebody coming down the ravine, fired into the darkness, and somebody yelled out in pain. And so they thought he had killed one of these soldiers. He'd never seen him. He didn't know what he'd hit, he didn't know who he'd hit, he didn't know where he'd hit him. So they gave this boy the name Kills at Night. And I was told that story by 2 of his granddaughters up at Little Bighorn Battlefield in 2005. So John Thompson might have been one of the people that was wounded by the boy who came to be known as Kills at Night. But certainly he was one of those brave men who went down to the river to get water for the wounded and got the Medal of Honour for his troubles. He also wrote a rather interesting story about Little Bighorn. If you want to read it, you can get it as a free download, a free e-book to read at your leisure on your computer or on your Kindle or your iPad or whatever it is you're using. It's a very controversial story. There are some details in it that I think can't possibly be true. There are other details in it that I think are very interesting and might be true. But what's certainly the case is that the best-selling The Last Stand by Nathaniel Philbrick, which was published about 18 months ago, uses Thompson's narrative quite substantially in the way in which he tells the story of the battle. But Thompson was from Markinch in Fife. He was the Scots-born soldier with Custer who won the Medal of Honour. So what does it all mean? When I was preparing my talk for today, I thought, should I dress as a fighter for the frontier? Should I dress as a Scot? And I thought, I'll just go with cavalry blue.